Hey guys, Wave Nunnally here with Bible Unplugged. Thank you for joining us on our last segment in the series on the Sermon on the Mount. Today we're going to look at a really interesting word of Jesus that gives us instruction on how we connect anger and our ability to speak, and how that impacts people that we live in community with. The passage that I'm referring to is Matthew chapter 5, verse 22. There Jesus says, "Everyone who is angry with his brother will be guilty before the court. And whoever will say to his brother, Raka," it's actually pronounced in Hebrew, Reka, "shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever shall say, you fool, will be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." What in the world is this talking about? And why is Jesus coming down so hard on just the connection between anger and the use of language, the use of our tongue? Let's take a look at the entire story. And we're going to look at a number of different kind of perspectives or pieces of the contextual pie. And so the whole story, it actually backs up to Matthew 5:21 and goes all the way through chapter 5, verse 24. So we're looking at the whole story, or what scholars call the literary context, the larger literary context. Backing up to verse 25, Jesus quotes the Hebrew Bible. He's actually quoting Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy 5 that give us the 10 commandments. Well, one of those commandments is, you shall not kill, or more accurately, commit murder. Jesus says, you've heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder will be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be guilty before the court. Whoever will say to his brother, Reka, will be guilty before the Sanhedrin or Sanhedrin. And whoever says, you fool, will be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. The Greek there is Gehenna, or Gehenom, Jesus' favorite word for hell. So Jesus is connecting this being angry with your brother and then expressing that verbally in very inappropriate and derogatory ways. He's connecting that to the commandment, you shall not commit murder, don't kill. He's saying that this is connected to, this is physical killing, and this is sort of like character assassination or verbal abuse, verbal injury done to a person. Jesus is actually, in comparison to what so many people say, when Jesus is here, it's all greasy grace and sloppe agape, and He lowers the bar so that we don't feel so condemned and feel better about ourselves and all kinds of stuff like that. But in all of these, what are called the antitheses, Jesus raises the bar. He raises the level of expectation. Of course, that's exactly what we would assume would happen, because with greater revelation and more empowerment that God brings into our lives under the new covenant, you would expect the bar to be raised, and that's exactly what Jesus says. Just as another example, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, anyone who looks at a woman to lust. And so all of these antitheses, or this whole passage that deals with you've heard it said, but I say to you, raises the bar, doesn't lower it. So he says, yeah, it's wrong to commit literal physical murder. It's also really bad, unhealthy, unhelpful to the covenant community to do this with your words. So this is providing some really interesting, I think, helpful backstory or context to the words of Jesus. Jesus continues in this passage. So if you're presenting your offering at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you. So it's whether he's addressing this issue of if you've got something against your brother, you're angry. Now he's giving the other side of the coin. If your brother has something against you, take the initiative, Jesus says. Leave your offering there at the altar go your way, be reconciled first to your brother, this fellow covenant community member, and then come and present your offering. So Jesus is saying, in this pursuit of righteousness, you should take the responsibility to take the initiative to make a relationship, to restore a relationship that in some way has become broken. Let's take another look, another chunk of the evidential pie, of the context pie. In Matthew chapter 25, verse 22, we want to look at the literary form. How did Jesus construct His saying? And I have patterned this, I've constructed this in a way that shows the poetic parallelism. Again, if you're not familiar with the term, go back and listen to some of the previous episodes that we've done, and we talk a lot about Hebrew poetic parallelism, saying the same thing multiple ways but using different words each time. Everyone who is angry with his brother will be guilty of, the Greek reads, judgment. And whoever will say to his brother, Rekah, will be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever will say, you fool, will be guilty to go into Gehinnom, or into hell. So he's basically saying the same thing. He's making the same point three different ways. There is a connection, an inherent connection with the emotion of anger that is then expressed in very derogatory, shaming kind of language, intentional public embarrassment. And we'll see this as we continue our study and look at other texts. So anger then brings forth language directed toward an individual that we're supposed to be in covenant relationship with and are supposed to be upbuilding that person, instead using the tongue to tear down that person, to injure that person, to embarrass, to bring public shame to that person. Now let's look at the biblical background, another chunk of the evidential pie or the context pie. And the place where Jesus is evidently drawing this ethic, which is really, really high. Most of the time, we'll hear, well, you know, I don't believe in violence, so I'm not going to kill anybody, I'm not going to hurt anybody physically, but we then end up injuring people with the language that we use toward or about them. Jesus will remove that from the table. He's saying that one is the same, is closely related to the other. One is physical injury, the other is internal, personal, emotional, social damage done to the person. But he's bringing this from the ethic of Leviticus chapter 19. You shall not take vengeance. You shall not bear a grudge. Those are the things that beget anger against the sons of your people. There's that brother language that Jesus uses. Fellow covenant community member, the sons of your people, but rather you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Well, you'll remember that we just did a segment on the golden rule, Jesus do unto others kind of language. However you want people to treat you, so treat them. Well, what Jesus has done now is He's taken this to the next level, and He's talking about not just your physical actions toward individuals, but the language that you use regarding other individuals, hurting them socially, embarrassing them, bringing shame to them publicly. However you want people to treat them, you so treat them. And in Luke's version, just as you want people to treat you, treat them in the same way. Or the old King James, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is the highest ethical plane known to man, that we should reflect on how we want to be treated and then treat other people in the same way. I'd like to go to a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is from the 2nd century, 1st century BC. It's pre-Christian. And they're going to introduce to us another related set of texts from the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Looking at a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Damascus Covenant. It's not all Bible. It contains Bible and then its commentary, the sect, the group's commentary on the Bible passages. Concerning the saying, you shall not take vengeance on the children of your people, nor shall you bear a grudge against them. There's that Leviticus passage. So these guys, Jesus and the Dead Sea community, are both working with the same text, this Leviticus 19:18. By the way, just a real quick parenthetical remark. Do you notice where this is coming from? The book of Leviticus. You think, well, that's all about priestly duties and about sacrifices, this, that, and the other. I haven't done a sermon, or I hadn't heard a sermon, or I haven't done Bible study or whatever on anything in Leviticus in a really long time. Well, look where this is coming from. The highest ethical standards known to man are coming straight out of the book of Leviticus. I would suggest that this is worthwhile study of the Christian. Jewish people for sure, but of Christians as well, because this is where so much, from Jesus' perspective, the rabbi's perspective, the Dead Sea community that created the Dead Sea Scrolls, from their perspective, they're all tracking back to the same authoritative biblical text from the Torah. So don't bear a grudge. Don't take vengeance on a member of the covenant. There you go. There's that covenantal language. Brother, Jesus says. Accuses, that's the use of the tongue, his neighbor. There you get that love your neighbor as yourself. Accuses his neighbor without first rebuking him before witnesses. Well, what is that all about? Deuteronomy chapters 17 and 19 talk about on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Christians will say, oh my goodness, well that really sounds familiar. Yes, absolutely, because Jesus says if you go to someone and you confront them with a sin, with a problem they're having in their personal lives, then if they don't listen to you, then you are to take 2 or 3 witnesses, people who have seen or heard that person do or say something. In 2 Corinthians, Paul will make reference to these passages, Deuteronomy 17, Deuteronomy 19, and he will do it again in 1 Timothy. Don't maintain a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So this is what the Qumran community, the Dead Sea community, is talking about when they're talking about rebuking him before the witnesses, people who have some knowledge, firsthand knowledge of the situation at hand. Continuing with this Dead Sea text, the Damascus covenant, if he denounces him, there's use of the tongue. We're supposed to be treating them as we want to be treated. We're supposed to be loving our neighbor as ourselves. Then we're supposed to avoid denouncing. If he denounces him in the heat of his anger, bam, there we get this connection between some very, strong emotion and the use of the tongue. Same thing that we got in Matthew chapter 5. Denounces him in the heat of his anger, or reports him, there's another place where the tongue is involved, to his elders to make him look contemptible, to bring shame, to bring reproach on this individual before his peers. Then he is one who takes vengeance, which the Bible says don't do. And he bears a grudge, which again, Leviticus 19, don't do. Although it is expressly written, this is a text from the prophet Nahum in chapter 1, verse 2. He, meaning God, capital H, God is the one who takes vengeance upon God's adversaries, and God bears a grudge against His enemies. In other words, we have just usurped an option that is available only to God. This is something that only God is supposed to do, taking vengeance, bearing a grudge. It is unhealthy, it is not helpful for either party involved when this happens among the covenant community. When one is denouncing, declaring contemptible a fellow covenant community member, that then brings shame, reproach, discouragement, despair, and a distance between that person and other members of the community. Continuing the same text in the Dead Sea Scrolls, if he holds his peace, that's being quiet, not speaking toward him from one day to another, and thereafter speaks of him in the heat of his anger, he testifies against himself. He's only hurting himself. And then concerning a capital matter. Wow, you know about capital punishment. That's the way that word's being used there. He's testifying against him. He's become a witness against himself that now it's not just a matter of being angry. It's not just a matter of having some issue between you and another person in the faith community, but now it is all of a sudden risen to the level of being a capital matter. Well, that's really interesting because Jesus wed those two as well. He said, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit murder. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. But I say to you, whoever says rekah, or whoever calls someone you fool. So he's connecting those two things, a capital matter, taking someone's life, and this use of speaking, language, the use of words that we select. He testifies against himself concerning a capital matter. We will hear more from the rabbis on this, so hold that thought. Because he has not fulfilled the commandment of God, which tells him, you shall rebuke your neighbor and not be burdened with sin because of him. This is the verse just before love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, don't harbor rancor. Don't harbor ill will toward someone. If there is an issue, go to the person and deal with it then. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't hold that in to the point of it boiling over into inappropriate language and hurtful attitudes, behavior, and words. This is where Paul goes precisely in Ephesians chapter 4. Be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. So where's Paul coming from on this? From his Bible, Psalm 4, verse 4. Tremble, but don't sin. Meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still. Paul has just basically paraphrased this. By the way, the difference between be angry and tremble is simply a matter of modern translators, because in the psalm, the word for tremble comes from the root ragaz, which means to be agitated or angry. James and John were actually called that by Jesus when they were traveling through Samaria, and one city, one village wouldn't receive them. And so James and John go to Jesus and say, hey, do you want us to call down fire from heaven like Elijah did? Call fire down from heaven on these people? And Jesus began to call them sons of Regesh, B'nai Regesh, or as it shows up in Greek, Boanerges, which is kind of difficult to parse out, but there it is. Anger, resentment, agitation at someone. So tremble and be angry, those are basically interchangeable, because we're going back to the original language, and we see that indeed Paul is totally justified in translating Psalm 4 into Greek, be angry, because of the use of the word, rigzu, or the verb root regesh, ragash. All right. In the book of James, we're looking at biblical backgrounds and connections. In the book of James, now James is raised by Joseph and Mary, the same parents that Jesus was raised by. So there are lots and lots of interesting parallels between the epistle or letter of James and the Sermon on the Mount. And it would make sense that that would be the case, since they are both coming from the same family of origin. So James says, this you know, my beloved brethren, but let everyone be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. Do you see the connection between talking and anger there? And James says this, because the anger of human beings does not accomplish the righteousness of God. Be careful how we express. It's not wrong. Paul said, be angry and don't sin. The psalmist said, be angry and don't sin. But where wrong, where sin, where hurt comes in, is when we give unhealthy expression to that anger, and that includes not just physical violence, but it also includes verbal violence, how we use our words. James will continue. The tongue is a fire, and the very world of iniquity. The tongue, speaking. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the whole body. It sets on fire the whole course of life. And it is set on fire by hell. That's the origin of this stuff. That's the real author of this, is the enemy of our souls. For every species of beasts and birds, etc., human beings have been able to tame. But not so the tongue. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and is full of deadly poison. There again is a reference to speaking and death, or murder even, as the commandment, thou shalt not murder, plays into this. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. Now we're getting down to some of the nitty-gritty, the reason why we are to be so careful with the way that we speak to other people. Other people, like us, are made in the very image of God and are therefore of inestimable worth. We are not plants. We are not other members of the animal kingdom. We are made, human beings are made in the likeness of God. How can it be that we utter blessing to our Lord and Father while we curse men who are created in the likeness of God? So from the same mouth, James says, come both blessing and cursing. And his conclusion, his admonition, his challenge is, my covenant community members, fellow covenant community members, my brothers, these things should not be so. Shouldn't be like this. There is another way forward. Let's take a look now at rabbinic background. We've looked at Bible background, both Hebrew Bible and New Testament. Let's take a look at what the rabbis have to say. And when we do, I want you to keep in mind a verse that has been running in the background during this entire study. This is absolutely fascinating because Ben-Sion Wacholder, my doctor father, the guy who guided me through my doctoral dissertation, a Holocaust survivor, and a preeminent student, scholar on the Dead Sea Scrolls, he said that if you want to understand the words of Jesus, you've got to understand that he operated in the same way that other Second Temple period, our time period that we're involved in with the New Testament. Second Temple period sages always had a Bible verse running in the background. This would be one that I'd encourage you to keep in your mind as we look at what the rabbis will have to say. And it's Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by a man his blood will be shed, because in the image of God, God, capital H, made man. So man is of inestimable worth, and his sacredness should be preserved. If he is created in God's image, then he should be respected much more highly than anything else in God's created order. Whoever sheds man's blood, that's that reason for don't kill. In the image of God, he has been made by God. So keep that in mind as we look at some passages from the rabbis. First one is from the earliest of the collected sayings of the early sages, and that's Rabbi Elazar of Modin. He says, he who causes his fellow's face to blush in public has no share in the world to come. Harsh words from Rabbi Eliezer. But it's moving in this direction of bringing public shame to a fellow covenant community member, bringing embarrassment, causing a person hurt among the community of the faithful. And this person, if you engage in that, this person has no share in the world to come. A very harsh saying. But then we get an understanding, an interpretation of that saying in a later text. BT is always for us Babylonian Talmud. I don't always have the room at the top of the screen to put the entire reference, but the Babylonian Talmud. And a Tana recited, if one whitens his neighbor's face in public, it's as if he sheds blood. There's where we get that Jesus connection of you shall not kill or murder, but I say if you call someone rekah, or if you call someone you fool, then that will bring judgment. That creates a really bad situation in the covenant community. So if one whitens his neighbor's face in public, it's as though he sheds blood. Rabbi Nachman says this makes perfect sense because we see ruddiness, a red complexion, and paleness take its place. Ruddiness leaves and paleness takes its place. When your face goes white because someone has so embarrassed you, has so shamed you in public, they're reading the cards and they say, this is exactly what's happened, and it's like shedding blood when the blood leaves your face and you become pale with embarrassment, shame, and hurt in a public context. Hope it's coming together for you here. Because this is exactly what Jesus is talking about when He connects this, don't commit murder, but I say to you, don't say to your brother, rekah, and you fool. Now, this word rekah, if you look in a lot of your English translations, it will say something like, in the footnote, an Aramaic word of obscure origin or obscure meaning. Neither of those is the case. It's not Aramaic. It shows up almost a dozen times in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. So if it's in the Hebrew Bible, that also means it's not Aramaic. It's not Aramaic, it's Hebrew, and it's not obscure in terms of its meaning. We know what the word rake means. It means empty. You know, like a vessel is empty, doesn't have any water or any wine or any oil or whatever in it. It is rake. It is empty. If it's rekah, it means worthless. Like if an animal is killed by another animal, well then it's not useful. You can't eat it according to the law of Moses. It can't be sacrificed. It is worthless. That sort of thing. And so this word shows up in the Hebrew Bible. It shows up all over the place in the writings of the rabbis, and its meaning is perfectly clear. It means someone who is base, someone who is worthless, someone who is completely useless, it can do no good kind of thing. And what Jesus is saying is, God may have, and the Bible talks about, uses the word fool and that kind of thing. The Bible will use that kind of language with respect to people, but that's God saying that about folks. And He has that right. He's their creator and He's their owner. He's the boss. We are not. We do not have the right to pass judgment on an individual and say, well, you know, that person's just human garbage. You know, that person is totally worthless. That person's good for nothing. That person will never come to any good. That person is totally devoid of human value. You know, that person's just taking up space. That person's just using up oxygen. We hear these kinds of things said in our culture on a relatively regular basis. We hear it on TV. We hear it out in the marketplace. We may have even engaged in some of that ourselves. What I'm saying is, and I'm trying to bring this as clearly into perspective as I can, what Jesus is saying is we don't have the privilege of passing that value judgment on a fellow human being created in the image of God. Consequently, what Jesus is saying is you need to be careful with your words, because murder can happen not just in a literal, physical kind of way, but we can really hurt a person's standing in the community, hurt a person's reputation, we can really hurt a person's feelings, we can hurt the way that individuals in families and other situations interact with one another. We can do harm to other people with our words. That should not come as any big surprise. It's happened to you. It's happened to other people that you know. It may have happened by your words to someone else. Well, that's just a situation that Jesus is naturally going to address. It happens all the time. It happens in every community. And why would Jesus avoid that? When He's trying to constitute a new covenant community who live according to His words and His lifestyle, who are empowered by His Spirit to live in a way that is different from the rest of the world out there and more properly reflects the character and the nature of God, Why wouldn't Jesus address that? Well, the reality is He does, and that's what we're studying here today. So, on Rekah, hopefully from now on, when you read over that, it won't just be some strange word that you never read anywhere else, and that you have no idea what it means, so you just kind of skip on. Well, it has a whole lot to do, this poetic parallelism thing, with fool. The Bible will say, a fool says in his heart there is no God, or you fool, tonight this very night your soul will be required of you. Okay, God can say those kinds of things. We're supposed to avoid those kinds of value judgments on other human beings who are created by the same God in whose image they are created, by the same God who created us. All right. A couple of texts that I want to conclude with. This is rabbis. These are the early rabbis. Akiva is late 1st, early 2nd century. And he says, this is a great principle of the Torah. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And in Leviticus chapter 19, that's where we get that. Thus, Akiva says, one should not say, I should scorn my neighbor, or I will curse my neighbor. Well, Rabbi Tanhuma says, if you act in this way, realize who it is you are willing to have humiliated. A human being, the one who was made in the likeness of God. So, the use of language of a neighbor, and that brings humiliation to whom? Not just some animal, not just some flower, plant, or statue or whatever, but someone who is made in the very image of God. And I'd like to conclude our time together with a relatively lengthy story. But hey, everybody loves stories, right? And they usually end up keeping your attention. So here's a word video from the ancient world, from the same rabbis that are walking the streets, walking the roads of the land of Israel around the time that Jesus was, having similar experiences, dealing with the same culture and the same language. So, an incident occurred in which Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Shimon, came from Migdal Gedor, from his rabbi's house. So they'd been there studying together. And he was riding on a donkey and strolling on the bank of the river. He was very happy, and his head was swollen with pride because he had studied much Torah. He really thought that he was somebody and that he was something. He had really done something with his life. He happened upon an exceedingly ugly person. I'm sure that that's never happened to you, so you can't really relate to this, but there'll always be these gorgeously beautiful, incredible people, and then there'll always be these folks who are on the other end of the spectrum, and then there's most of the rest of society somewhere in between, but that's going to happen. An exceedingly ugly person who said to him, "Greetings to you, my rabbi." He's respecting him, greeting him with a great deal of respect. But Rabbi Eliezer did not return his greeting. Instead, Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "You Rekah person," there's the word, I told you it's all over the place in the works of the early rabbis. "You worthless, you devoid of human value, you good for nothing person, how ugly you are. Are all the people in your city as ugly as you?" I told you this would be fun, right? Great story. The man said to him, listen to the way that this poor old ugly guy, not someone who'd been studying with the preeminent rabbi of his time and filled with the knowledge of Torah and whatever, but the man said to him, "I don't know. You should go and say to the craftsman who made me, how ugly is the vessel that you made." In other words, take that comment to God and see what He thinks of it. You know, the God who created me and created me this way, and I am created in His, ugly or not, or even somewhere in between, created me in His very image. When Rabbi Eliezer realized that he had sinned, he sinned not just with physical killing or injury, but with an injury by the tongue. He had sinned and had insulted this man merely on account of his appearance. Then he got down off of the donkey and he prostrated himself before the ugly man. And he said to the man, I have sinned against you. Please forgive me. This is the kind of attitude that I think that we should have. Yes, our prisons are filled with murderers, literal murderers who have taken people's lives. But our streets, our homes, our businesses, our marketplaces are filled with folks who have done violence to other individuals by the use of their tongue, by the words that they choose. Our words can be uplifting. Our words can be very hurtful and destructive. Let's choose the helpful and the encouraging and the healing and the upbuilding and the strengthening use of language, as opposed to that which tears down, that which brings destruction and hurt, pain in its wake. Am I saying this because we can just do this by our own willpower, our own desire, our choice? No. I'm saying this to a group of people who have been given the promise that if we will open ourselves, God will empower us to live the way He's called us to live. I'm not saying you go out and get this done on your own. That's not really possible. You heard those words of James. We can tame the whole world, but we have a really difficult time taming this one little tiny member of our own body. So I'm not saying go out there and make that happen on your own strength, or in your own willpower, or just because you're such a cool, awesome, and super spiritual person. Lean to the God who calls us into covenant relationship, calls us to reflect His nature properly, but lean to Him to empower you to live that life that is encouraging, strengthening, and upbuilding. And He will meet you, and He will do that. He will work in you. He changes our natures. And that is good news. Hey, I hope that you have benefited from this study. I know that it wasn't one of the easiest ones, hasn't been one of the shortest ones. It's probably been a more involved, more all over the place, looking at Jesus, looking at the Hebrew Bible, looking at the rabbis, looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. But look, we just ended up understanding one of these precious words of Jesus that so many people for so many years have just kind of skipped over because they didn't know what to do with it. Well, we know exactly what's going on with that now. At least I hope that we've arrived at some point of greater clarity on one of these precious words of Jesus. I hope that you have also benefited from the other 7 segments. This is the 8th of 8. The other 7 segments that we've done in this Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. And I hope that you've come to a point where you have appreciated how He engages His world right at the flashpoint of culture and language and human issues and human interaction. And I hope that you've come to appreciate His creativity, the beauty of Him as a person and as a communicator, and as one who's taking us to the next developmental level in relationship with God. And I hope that it has touched your life in such a way that you are challenged to come up higher to this higher ethical plane or standard that Jesus set in the Sermon on the Mount. This is what we do at Bible Unplugged, you know? It's all about background. It's all about culture. It's all about context. It's all about language. It's all about these literatures that are swirling around the world of the New Testament. And I hope that if it's helped you, that you will share that with other folks, like maybe a home group leader where you go to study the Bible midweek, or maybe a Sunday school teacher. Maybe you could share this with folks who regularly do devotions along this line. Please feel free to use all of that stuff on the YouTube channel, on the Facebook page, and pass the word along. If it's helped you, it'll help somebody else. Hey, until next time, Wave Nunnally, Bible Unplugged. God bless you. We'll see you in the next segment. God bless.